I poured everything into building a life here, my savings, my peace, my pride. And for what? To be harassed by a woman with a clipboard and a god complex? Karen Whitmore made it her mission to tear me down, targeting my family, my dignity, my home. The silence from the HOA, the fake rules, the racism cloaked in policy, it was all infuriating. I wasn't just disappointed. I was enraged. They tried to break me. But they forgot, I fight back. 3 years ago, I moved into Oak Ridge Estates, a place that, on paper, looked like the American dream. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed hedges, and porches big enough to host Sunday barbecues. For a 38-year-old IT consultant like me, Paul Johnson, it felt like I'd finally made it. After years of late-night coding, missed vacations, and climbing the corporate ladder, I'd bought my first home. A beautiful 2-story colonial on a quiet street just outside Atlanta. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways and dogs never barked past 8 p.m. peaceful, orderly, serene. But it didn't take long to realize that behind those perfect white fences and manicured lawns lurked something much less welcoming. Her name was Karen Whitmore. The HOA president. Or as I started to think of her, the queen of petty rules and power trips. She didn't run Oak Ridge Estates, she ruled it. And from the moment I moved in, she had her eyes on me. I didn't fit her picture-perfect idea of what this neighborhood should be. But I paid my dues, followed the rules, and kept my head down, until she went too far. What started as a peaceful chapter was about to turn into a battle I never saw coming. It started with a green slip of paper tucked under my windshield. Violation notice, trash bins visible from street. I stared at it in disbelief, my coffee growing cold in my hand. My bins were exactly where the garbage company told us to leave them. Neighbors on either side did the same. Yet somehow, mine were the only ones that warranted a citation. I crumpled the notice and tossed it into the passenger seat, thinking it had to be a mistake. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. The next week it was a warning about the color of my mulch, yes, my mulch, followed by a letter scolding me about an oil stain on my driveway so faint it looked like a shadow. I started to feel like I was being watched. Every move I made on my own property felt like it was under surveillance. I'd see Karen Whitmore walking her yippee little dog at the exact same time every morning, tablet in hand, pretending to scroll through messages while clearly snapping pictures of my house. Her pastel pantsuit collection made her easy to spot, but it was her smug smile that made my blood boil. I tried to stay calm, tried to remind myself that I'd worked too hard to let one woman ruin the dream I'd built. But when I found a fine in my mailbox for non-compliant landscaping, just hours after I'd trimmed the hedges myself, perfectly, I felt my composure crack. I was outraged. Not just because of the petty violations, but because I could see exactly what was happening. I was being singled out, targeted. And not one of my neighbors seemed to notice or care. I thought about my dad, Victor, who was visiting in a few weeks. How would Karen treat him? Would she fine me for having my own father sleep in my guest room? The injustice of it all gnawed at me. I wasn't just annoyed, I was furious. I had worked for this home, paid for this land, and now I was being treated like an outsider. And I hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The doorbell rang on a crisp Friday afternoon, just as I was setting out Dad's favorite tea, jasmine green, the kind he used to sip on the porch back home in Baton Rouge. Victor Johnson had driven down from Louisiana to visit me for the first time since I'd bought the house. At 75, he still had the presence of a man who'd weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. A retired brick mason, Dad wasn't easily rattled, but when I opened the door and saw him standing there, suitcase in one hand, a confused look on his face, I knew something was off. "You didn't tell me your HOA was the FBI," he grumbled, stepping inside. That woman outside stopped me like I was trespassing. I froze. "Karen?" He nodded. Tall, tight curls, clipboard glued to her hand, eyes like a hawk. "Yeah. Said I needed some kind of guest badge to stay overnight. I told her I was your father, not a pizza delivery. My stomach sank. I shouldn't have been surprised, but somehow, I was. Even I hadn't expected Karen to go that far. My own father, barely up the front walk, was already being treated like a suspect in a gated paradise. Later, as we sat on the porch, Dad tried to laugh it off. "This what I raised you for?" he asked with a half-smile. "To pay a mortgage just to be harassed?" He was joking, but there was something in his voice, disappointment maybe, or worry. I hated that. I hated that this was his first impression of my home. The house I had worked long nights for. The one I'd bought so he could have a guest room with a view of the hills and a porch to drink his tea on. Now, instead, he was being treated like an intruder. "I'm going to handle it," I told him. "Karen's been pushing boundaries for too long." Dad set down his mug. "Son, if you don't push back, bullies like that never stop." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene at the front door, the indignity of it all. Karen's smug tone, my father's furrowed brow. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about my family, my pride, and the line that Karen had finally crossed. I realized then, I wasn't just going to deal with her. I was going to stop her. The next morning, I was up before dawn, staring at the pale glow of my laptop in the dark kitchen. Dad was still asleep in the guest room, snoring softly, completely unaware that I'd barely shut my eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about Karen, her smug face, her clipboard of fabricated rules, and the $1,500 fine she was threatening us with. I poured another cup of black coffee and dove headfirst into the Oak Ridge Estates HOA bylaws, a labyrinth of vague regulations and passive-aggressive language dressed up in professional formatting. The suspense was electric. Line after line, I searched for any mention of a guest permit requirement. Nothing. No section about overnight stays, no clause about registering family members, and certainly no justification for a fine. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became, Karen had made it all up. But the real question was, how many other residents had she done this to? And had they just paid the fines out of fear? I started making calls. The Georgia Department of Community Affairs, the local Housing Rights Office, even a consumer protection hotline. I sent emails, filled out forms, and left messages, each one a thread in the net I was casting around Karen. As I waited for answers, the anticipation buzzed beneath my skin like static. If I was right, this wasn't just petty harassment, it was illegal. Then came the email. Subject line, regarding your HOA inquiry, urgent response. I opened it so fast I nearly spilled my coffee. It was from the state's HOA Regulatory Board. They'd reviewed my submission, and what Karen had done, if proven, could be considered selective enforcement and abuse of HOA authority. My heart pounded as I read the last line. We recommend attending the next HOA meeting and requesting a formal review. Please keep us informed. I looked up from the screen, a slow grin spreading across my face. Karen had built her power on smoke and mirrors, but I had just lit the match. And the meeting? It was scheduled for Tuesday at 11 a.m., just enough time to prepare. Tuesday morning arrived like a storm on the horizon, tense, electric, inevitable. I stood outside the Oak Ridge clubhouse, the sun barely warming the air, my folder of evidence tucked under my arm like a shield. Inside, I knew what waited. Karen Whitmore perched at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by her loyal lieutenants in pastel cardigans and decades-old grudges. I wasn't just walking into a meeting, I was walking into a lion's den. As I pushed open the doors, the low murmur of conversation stopped cold. Every head turned. Karen's eyes locked on mine, her smile tight and artificial. "Ah, Paul," she purred. "We were just getting started. Please, have a seat." But I didn't sit. I walked straight to the table, placed my folder down with a satisfying thump, and looked Karen dead in the eye. Actually, I said evenly, I'm here to address something that affects every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates. She blinked, just once. Then I opened the folder and began. I spoke clearly, methodically, quoting Georgia housing laws, citing the Fair Housing Act, referencing the emails I'd received from the state authorities. With every sentence, Karen's expression stiffened, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. Her allies exchanged uneasy glances as I laid out her pattern of fabricated rules and discriminatory enforcement. I produced the HOA bylaws, highlighted, tabbed, annotated. Nowhere, I said, tapping the guest policy section, does it mention a requirement for visitor permits. Yet somehow, I'm being fined for not filing one. Silence hung in the air like a held breath. Karen tried to dismiss my claims with her usual syrupy condescension, but the room was shifting. The board members looked less like disciples and more like jurors, glancing between each other, questioning her authority for the first time. The cracks had started to show. And Karen knew it. The shift was subtle at first, a glance exchanged between board members, a raised eyebrow, a hesitant frown. But as I stood at the front of that HOA meeting, armed with facts, law, and a fierce refusal to be silenced, something unmistakable bloomed in the room: doubt. Not about me, but about Karen Whitmore. Her voice, once so commanding, now rang hollow. Her justifications wobbled like a card tower in a breeze. And I was the breeze. I laid the final blow on the polished table, a signed letter from the Georgia Department of Community Affairs confirming that there was no legal precedent for the so-called guest permit policy, and that such fines, when enforced selectively, could be construed as harassment and discrimination under state law. I looked Karen square in the eye, the silence so heavy you could hear the ceiling fan hum. You didn't just lie, I said calmly. You used fear. You targeted people who didn't look like you, who didn't move here with your approval, and who refused to bow to your false authority. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked to her allies, once loyal, now visibly squirming. One older woman cleared her throat and said, barely above a whisper, maybe, we should review the policy. Empowerment surged in my chest, not just because I stood up for myself, but because the truth had pierced through the paper-thin curtain of Karen's control. I wasn't alone anymore. Eyes once full of indifference now burned with recognition. I had lit a spark, and it was catching. Then came Evelyn Carter, an HOA board member who had kept mostly quiet until now. A retired attorney with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, she leaned forward, hands folded. Paul has raised valid legal concerns, she said. We can't enforce rules that don't exist, nor can we treat homeowners unequally. This is not just an HOA issue, it's a justice issue. Karen's face froze. For the first time, she didn't speak. Couldn't. In that moment, I felt taller. Not because I had won, but because I had stood my ground, calmly, relentlessly, with truth as my weapon. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't stormed out. I simply refused to be erased. Justice didn't need noise. It needed courage. And today, it had found its voice. The days following the HOA meeting felt eerily quiet, too quiet. You'd think after being publicly exposed, Karen Whitmore would slink into the background. But that's not how people like her operate. When they lose power, they don't retreat, they retaliate. I felt it in the way my mailbox suddenly disappeared one morning, the screws still rattling on the ground like a warning. I felt it in the 3 separate violation notices I received in a single week, all concerning my trash bins, which now, according to Karen, were too visible, too close to the curb, and not properly secured. Each one more absurd than the last. Then came the letter about my front door. Apparently, my perfectly ordinary deep brown door, same color it had been since I bought the place, was not within the HOA's approved neutral palette. The kicker. My next-door neighbor had the same exact door color, untouched by Karen's wrath. Coincidence? Please. The landscapers, who had never so much as touched my yard before, suddenly took a special interest in it. They scalped the grass down to the roots, leaving patches of dirt and uneven cuts like battle scars. When I asked them why, they just shrugged and mumbled something about HOA orders. I didn't respond publicly. Not yet. Karen wanted a reaction, wanted me to lash out so she could paint me as the problem. But instead, I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, security footage. I built my case in silence, stone by stone. Because I knew something she didn't, word was spreading. The neighbors were watching. And some of them had their own stories, their own scars left by Karen's reign of pettiness. I could feel the tide shifting. Her actions weren't just about me anymore. She was unraveling, and the more she tried to tighten her grip, the more her carefully manicured image cracked. The storm wasn't over. But the winds were starting to blow in a new direction. It started with a whisper, then it spread like wildfire. At first, it was just a couple of neighbors nodding at me a little longer than usual, their eyes filled with something between curiosity and quiet solidarity. But soon, the dam broke. One by one, the stories poured out. Mrs. Langston, who had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for over 30 years, revealed how Karen once denied her request to install a wheelchair ramp for her husband because it clashed with the sidewalk aesthetic. A single mom down the street confided that she'd been fined for letting her teenage brother stay over while he searched for work. And perhaps most damning, a young couple shared how their landscaping bill had mysteriously skyrocketed, while the HOA's maintenance budget had mysteriously disappeared. I wasn't alone anymore. Karen's pattern of selective enforcement, petty fines, and manipulative tactics had finally caught up with her. The stories aligned like puzzle pieces, and the picture they painted wasn't just ugly, it was illegal. A formal complaint was submitted to the Georgia State Housing Authority, signed by dozens of residents. An investigation was launched. And then, with no grand announcement, no farewell speech, just a 2-sentence email, it was over. Karen Whitmore resigned. The woman who had weaponized neighborhood policy like a personal vendetta, gone. The woman who fined me $1,500 for letting my mother visit, vanished into the silence. Her house went up for sale, and the next week, the community bulletin board was filled with thank you notes, baked goods recipes, and welcome messages from neighbors who suddenly remembered what community felt like. It was the most poetic kind of justice, not delivered in a courtroom, but in front lawns, friendly waves, and families reclaiming peace. Karen ruled through fear, but when the community stopped fearing her, she crumbled. And as for me, I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun spill across Oak Ridge like it finally had permission to shine. The weeks after Karen's resignation felt like someone had finally turned off a blaring alarm that had been ringing in the background of our lives for years. At first, we were cautious, quietly optimistic but unsure if the peace would last. But gradually, we began to believe it. The silence in my mailbox spoke volumes, no more passive-aggressive letters about trash bins or mysterious violations. The air in Oak Ridge Estates felt different, lighter, freer. It wasn't just the absence of Karen, it was the presence of possibility. People began walking their dogs a little slower, chatting longer at the mailbox, even waving to each other with genuine warmth. We were neighbors again. Then came the election for the new HOA president. I didn't know what to expect. Honestly, I wasn't sure I cared, until I saw the name on the ballot, Evelyn Carter. I remembered her from block parties years ago, a retired attorney in her 60s, sharp as a tack and with the kind of no-nonsense grace that made you sit up straighter without even realizing it. She won unanimously. No smear campaigns, no debates, just a community finally ready for change. Her first meeting was unlike anything we'd seen before. No staged pageantry or rigid speeches. Evelyn stood before us, wearing jeans and a blazer, her voice steady and warm as she addressed the crowd. HOAs are meant to serve homeowners, she said. Not control them. The room erupted in applause. She didn't just make promises, she acted. The so-called guest permit policy was eliminated on day one. Every fine Karen had issued under her made-up rulebook was refunded. Landscaping budgets were audited and brought back under control. For the first time, the HOA operated like a service, not a dictatorship. Meetings were moved to the evening, allowing working residents to attend. Every new policy had to be reviewed by a community vote. And for me, I finally exhaled. I started hosting weekend cookouts on my porch again. My mom, Victor, came to visit without fear of being fined for unauthorized existence. Neighbors brought peach cobblers, coleslaw, ribs, and stories. Real stories. We were no longer victims of an HOA regime, we were rebuilding a neighborhood, one laughter-filled Saturday at a time. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates felt like a place where we all belonged. And that was the kind of justice that didn't need a courtroom, it just needed people to stand up and say, enough. It was a Saturday morning when the last piece of Karen's reign was erased, not with drama or headlines, but with laughter. I was standing at my grill, flipping burgers for the first community cookout in years, when I looked around and saw the true face of victory, kids riding bikes without fear of citation, neighbors trading recipes instead of complaints, and Victor sitting on my porch, sipping sweet tea and smiling like the proud father he always was. It wasn't just the return of peace, it was proof that we had won. A week before, Evelyn Carter had announced the final audit results. The financial discrepancies Karen had hidden under layers of fake landscaping bills and security upgrades had been uncovered. Over $20,000 in unjust fines had been refunded, and several former board members who once turned a blind eye were quietly asked to resign. That felt like justice. But the real triumph? It was watching the community come back to life. Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, who had once been too afraid to build a wheelchair ramp for their daughter, now had one proudly installed, complete with solar lights and flower boxes. Evelyn herself helped organize the installation crew. The single mother who'd been fined for her brother staying over. Now on the community welcome committee. Even the retired couple who once tiptoed around HOA meetings started leading gardening workshops. And me? I stood there in the heart of it all, surrounded by people who had once avoided eye contact in fear but now hugged, laughed, and shared stories like old friends. They thanked me, called me brave. But the truth? I just refused to let injustice make a home out of my peace. When someone handed me a paper plate with a slice of homemade peach pie and said, "To Paul Johnson, the man who stood up so the rest of us could sit in peace," I felt it, not pride, but vindication. Karen had tried to turn my life into a quiet defeat. But here I was, standing tall in the middle of a thriving, joyful neighborhood, no longer just a homeowner, but a reminder that when you fight back smart, calm, and loud enough, even the most controlling voices eventually fade. It was almost poetic, the way Karen vanished from Oak Ridge Estates, not with the fiery crash she might have imagined for herself, but with the slow, silent unraveling of everything she once clutched so tightly. Her power, once absolute and laced into every crevice of our neighborhood like a bad smell, dissolved with each passing day until all that remained was her name, a memory met with eye rolls and quiet chuckles. Victor had come to visit again, and we were sitting on my porch, watching as a moving truck backed up into Karen's driveway. The house had gone dark weeks ago, blinds shut, lawn untended. She didn't even bother with the courtesy of a farewell. No manicured wave from the porch, no clipboard clutched to her chest like a badge of honor. Just a pair of strangers in cargo shorts hauling her pastel boxes into a rattling truck. She didn't even say goodbye, Victor muttered with a low laugh. Guess she figured nobody would say it back. The neighborhood watched her go, but nobody said a word. Some people peered through curtains. Others pretended not to see. But I saw the little things, the satisfied nods, the coffee mugs raised in silent toasts, the unspoken relief that rippled through the air. Karen had lost not in one explosive moment, but in 1,000 tiny defeats, every complaint ignored, every meeting she no longer ran, every neighbor who no longer feared her. And the cherry on top? Word traveled that she had tried to join another HOA in a different town, only to be blocked before her first meeting even finished. The new president, an ex-naval commander named Ruth with zero tolerance for power plays, shut her down mid-sentence with the now famous quote, "Karen, this isn't a kingdom, and you're not the queen." Victor nearly fell out of his chair laughing when he heard it. Back in Oak Ridge, peace reigned. New leadership meant new beginnings. People walked their dogs without measuring leash lengths. Trash cans rolled out the night before pickup without penalty. Porches bloomed with wildflowers, and chalk drawings stretched across sidewalks again. Karen might have thought she'd shaped this place in her image, but she didn't realize, we were never hers to rule. And now that she was gone, Oak Ridge Estates didn't just recover, it bloomed. And in that full-circle moment, with Victor beside me and laughter echoing from every corner, I realized, we hadn't just outlasted Karen. We had erased her. Spring came early to Oak Ridge Estates that year, and with it, a feeling none of us had felt in ages, freedom. Not the quiet kind you whisper about, but the loud, living, laughing kind that bloomed across front lawns and spilled onto sidewalks. With Karen gone, it was like someone had opened a window and let fresh air pour into every corner of the neighborhood. Victor and I stood in the park one sunny Saturday morning, watching families gather under newly installed shade tents. Kids darted around, chasing bubbles and drawing wild patterns in chalk with no fear of getting a violation slip. Someone had fired up a grill, and the scent of hot dogs and charcoal floated through the breeze. A speaker played old soul music, and even Mrs. Delaney, who hadn't been to a gathering in years, was swaying gently to the beat. The HOA, now under Evelyn Carter's steady leadership, had transformed from a silent enforcer into a true community hub. They'd launched a Neighbors' Day initiative, offering help with home repairs for seniors and organizing monthly meetups. Victor smiled as he handed out lemonade from the booth we'd set up. "I haven't seen folks this happy since the 90s, he chuckled. What once was a fractured collection of homes had become a neighborhood again. People weren't just tolerating each other, they were showing up for each other. Whether it was patching a leaky roof or simply sharing stories on the porch, Oak Ridge had found its rhythm. And as we stood shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by music, laughter, and unity, I realized the real victory wasn't just Karen's exit. It was us, neighbors once divided, now united. We weren't just surviving. We were thriving. Together.